Morning melodies. The old wooden door of Rosemary Cafe creaked open precisely at 6:30 a.m., as it had every morning for the past 3 years. Fiona Bennett slipped inside, her violin case bumping gently against her hip as she navigated toward her usual corner table. Outside, autumn painted the small New England town in shades of amber and crimson, a beautiful backdrop that contrasted with the heaviness she carried in her heart. "The usual fi," called Olivier from behind the counter, her silver-streaked hair tucked beneath a faded bandana. Fiona nodded, setting down her violin case and unzipping her weathered jacket. "Thanks, Liv. Any chance I could stay until closing today? My apartment's heater is acting up again." "You know you're always welcome, honey, especially if you'll play a bit later." Olivia's eyes crinkled at the corners. That was their arrangement. Fiona would perform small impromptu concerts in the evenings, filling the cafe with classical melodies that drew in customers during typically slow hours. It wasn't much, but combined with her teaching at the community center, it helped chip away at the mountain of medical bills her father had left behind after his passing. As Fiona sipped her tea, she pulled out sheet music from her bag. She had 6 students today, all children whose parents believed in the power of music education, despite tight budgets. Fiona charged less than she should, knowing too well how luxury items like music lessons were often first to be cut from family budgets during hard times. The door chimed again, admitting a gust of wind and a tall figure Fiona had never seen before. He moved with the confident stride of someone accustomed to important places, yet his expression carried the unmistakable wariness of a person who had forgotten why those places mattered. Jackson Reed hadn't meant to stop here. His rental car's navigation system had failed, leading him 10 miles off the highway to this little town that wasn't even on his mental map. But the smell of coffee and the promise of directions had pulled him in. "Black coffee, strongest you've got," he told Olivia, drumming his fingers on the counter. His phone buzzed incessantly. 3 missed calls from his assistant, 2 from the label executives, and several texts about the upcoming project deadline. "Rough morning?" Olivia asked, sliding his coffee across the counter. Jackson looked up, momentarily startled by the genuine interest in her voice. In Los Angeles, baristas either recognized him as the 3-time Grammy-winning producer and font, or they were too busy with their own aspirations to care about customers beyond their tips. "Rough here," he admitted, surprising himself with his candor. As he waited for his coffee to cool, soft violin notes drifted through the cafe. Jackson turned, his producer's ears immediately catching the skillful nuance in the playing. In the corner sat a woman with copper-brown hair falling in loose waves around her face, eyes closed as her fingers danced across the strings of a well-loved violin. She wasn't playing anything he recognized, not classical repertoire or contemporary covers, but something that seemed to flow directly from her soul to her fingertips. It was raw, technically imperfect, yet more moving than most of the overproduced tracks he'd been assembling for months. "Who is she?" he asked Olivia quietly. "That's our Fiona. Teaches music to the local kids. Plays here at evenings, sometimes." Olivia smiled fondly. "Talent like hers doesn't belong in a small-town cafe, but we're grateful to have her anyway." Jackson found himself drawn to the empty chair near Fiona's table. He sat down, coffee forgotten, listening as the melody transformed from something melancholic to a theme that spoke of resilience. When she finally opened her eyes and noticed him, her fingers faltered. "Don't stop," he said quickly. "Please." Fiona blushed slightly. "Sorry, I don't usually have an audience this early. It's just thinking music." "Thinking music? What I play when I'm sorting things out in my head." She carefully lowered her violin. "You're not from around here." It wasn't a question, but Jackson answered anyway. "Just passing through. I'm Jackson, Fiona Bennett." She extended her hand, and he noticed small calluses on her fingertips, badges of her dedication to her instrument. Neither realized in that moment how significantly their lives had just changed, how this accidental meeting in a small-town cafe would soon unravel everything they thought they knew about success, sacrifice, and what it meant to truly be heard. Harmonized hearts. 3 weeks had passed since Jackson Reed's unexpected detour into Rosemary Cafe. What should have been a one-day delay had somehow stretched into a lingering stay at the town's only bed and breakfast. His assistant in Los Angeles was frantic, the record label executives increasingly impatient, but Jackson found himself unable to leave. The reason sat across from him now in the cafe's back garden, sunlight filtering through maple leaves to dance across her violin as Fiona played the composition they'd been refining together. "Try it again, but slow down the bridge section," Jackson suggested, recording the session on his phone. "Let it breathe more." Fiona nodded, adjusting her posture before drawing the bow across strings once more. The melody that emerged was hauntingly beautiful, a perfect blend of her emotional intuition and his technical expertise. "That's it," he whispered, more to himself than to her. "That's exactly what's been missing." When she finished, Fiona lowered her violin with an uncertain smile. "Better. It's perfect." Jackson ran a hand through his disheveled hair, a habit that had emerged as he'd gradually abandoned his polished LA appearance. "You have no idea what you've just done." What she'd done was solve the creative block that had been plaguing him for months. The soundtrack project that had brought him to the East Coast was for an indie film poised to be a major awards contender. But after producing hit after commercial hit, Jackson had found himself unable to capture the authentic emotion the director demanded. "I still don't understand why someone like you would need help from someone like me," Fiona said, carefully placing her violin in its case. The morning sunlight caught the thin scar along her wrist, a reminder of the car accident that had nearly ended her professional aspirations years ago. Jackson leaned forward. "Because you play from somewhere real, somewhere I haven't been able to access in years." He hesitated, then added, "The label wants predictable commercial success, but this film needs something honest." Olivia appeared with fresh tea for Fiona and coffee for Jackson. She'd memorized his preference for the Guatemalan dark roast within days. "You two making beautiful music together?" she asked with a barely concealed smile. Fiona blushed. "Just helping Jackson with some composition ideas." Olivia hummed skeptically as she retreated back inside. Once alone again, Jackson pulled out his tablet and slid it across the table. "I had my lawyer draw this up. A collaboration contract. Full co-composer credit, plus compensation that should help with." He trailed off, unsure how to delicately reference the financial struggles Fiona thought she'd kept hidden. Her eyes widened as she saw the figure. I can't accept this much for just playing around with a few melodies." "It's industry standard for what you're contributing," Jackson insisted, though they both knew it was considerably more. "Besides, the label has already approved your demos. They want 10 more pieces in this style." Fiona stared at the contract, her fingers trembling slightly. With this money, she could finally pay off her father's medical debt, fix the leaking roof in her small apartment, maybe even upgrade the community center's instruments. "There's something else," Jackson added hesitantly. "The director wants to meet you in New York next week." "New York?" Fiona nearly knocked over her tea. "I can't just go to New York. I have students. Responsibilities here. I've already spoken to the community center director. They're thrilled about the opportunity for you. They've arranged substitute teachers." Seeing her stunned expression, he quickly added, "I'm sorry if that was overstepping." Fiona fell silent, absently tracing the worn edges of her violin case. The truth was, she hadn't left this town since returning to care for her father during his illness 3 years ago. Before that, she'd been on track for a position with a respected orchestra, until the accident damaged her wrist and shattered her confidence. "What if I'm not what they expect?" she finally asked, voicing her deepest fear. Jackson reached across the table, his fingers stopping just short of touching hers. "You're more than they expect. That's why this will work." Later that evening, as stars appeared over the small town, Fiona played for the cafe's dinner crowd. The usual patrons had been joined by curious newcomers who'd heard rumors about the famous producer collaborating with their local violin teacher. Jackson sat in the back, watching as she transformed nervous energy into music that silenced every conversation. Halfway through her set, Fiona introduced a new piece, the one they'd worked on that morning. As the last note hung in the air, Jackson felt something shift inside him. He'd spent 15 years in an industry that manufactured emotions through technical precision. Yet here was something that couldn't be engineered or focus grouped into existence. After the applause died down and the cafe began to empty, Jackson helped Fiona pack up her violin. Their hands brushed, and neither pulled away immediately. "What if," he began carefully, "this project became something more than just the film score?" Fiona looked up, question in her eyes. "I have this idea for an album, classical foundations with contemporary elements. Your compositions, my production, something that breaks boundaries." His words came faster now, excitement building. "We could record here even. I could bring in a small team, set up a temporary studio." "Why would you do that? Your life, your career, it's all in LA." Jackson hadn't fully acknowledged his motivation even to himself until now. "Because for the first time in years I'm making music that matters. Because working with you," he hesitated, then finished simply, "it feels right." As they stood in the dimly lit cafe, the distance between them seemed to shrink. Not just physically, but the gap between their worlds, between who they had been and who they might become together. Fiona's phone chimed with a reminder about tomorrow's lessons, breaking the moment. "I should go," she said softly. "Early start tomorrow." Jackson nodded, stepping back. "Think about New York, please." After she left, he remained at the empty table, composing an email to the label that would either revitalize his career or end it completely. What he was proposing went against everything they'd planned, but as he thought of Fiona's music, he knew with absolute certainty it was worth the risk. Outside the cafe window, autumn leaves swirled in patterns as complex and beautiful as the emotions, taking root between two people who had found in each other what their music had been missing. Dissonant choices. New York City pulsed with a rhythm entirely different from the gentle cadence of Fiona's small town. From the 42nd floor of Meridian Records headquarters, Manhattan spread before her like an impossibly complex musical score, intimidating and alive with possibility. "They love your work," Jackson said, stepping into the conference room where Fiona stood by the window. His reflection appeared beside hers in the glass. his usual casual attire replaced by a tailored suit that reminded her of the distance between their worlds. Victoria wants to expand the project beyond the film score. Victoria Winters, Meridian's executive producer and Jackson's former mentor, had spent the morning dissecting their compositions with clinical precision. While her approval should have felt validating, something about the woman's calculating gaze had left Fiona uneasy. "Expand how?" Fiona asked, turning from the window. "Full studio album, promotional tour, maybe even a documentary about our collaborative process." Jackson's eyes shone with an excitement Fiona hadn't seen before. "They're talking about positioning you as the next crossover classical sensation." The words hung between them, heavier than Jackson seemed to realize. Fiona sank into one of the leather chairs surrounding the massive conference table. "That's not what we discussed. I agreed to help with the film score, nothing more." "I know, but think about what this could mean." Jackson sat beside her, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and unfamiliar. "Your music reaching millions, inspiring people everywhere, not just in our little cafe." "Our little cafe," Fiona echoed, noting how quickly it had become something quaint and insufficient in his mind. The same cafe where, just days ago, they had talked until closing time about the integrity of making art that served the emotion rather than the marketplace. A light knock interrupted them as Victoria entered without waiting for a response. Her sleek silver bob and impeccably pressed suit projected the confidence of someone accustomed to bending reality to her vision. "I've adjusted the contracts to reflect our expanded scope," she announced, sliding folders across the table. "We'll need to work quickly to capitalize on the momentum from the film release." Fiona opened the folder, eyes widening as she scanned the document. "This says I'd relocate to Los Angeles for 6 months minimum. I can't do that. My students can find another teacher." Victoria finished smoothly. "This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, Ms. Bennett. Few artists receive this level of investment from a label like Meridian." Jackson placed a gentle hand on Fiona's arm. "It's a lot to process. I know, but I'll be with you every step. We'll create something extraordinary together." Victoria's phone chimed. "The call will take you to dinner with Director Harlow at 7. He's eager to discuss how your compositions will enhance key emotional sequences." With a practiced smile that never reached her eyes, she departed, leaving behind the scent of ambition and expensive perfume. "You promised me," Fiona said once they were alone, her voice barely above a whisper. "You said we'd record in my town, that I could maintain my teaching, that this wouldn't change everything." Jackson ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that had once seemed endearing but now read as frustrated. "The situation evolved. That's how this industry works. You have to adapt when opportunities arise." "Opportunities for whom?" Fiona stood abruptly. "This isn't my dream, Jackson. This is yours. You're the one who's been desperate for a career reinvention." His expression hardened. "That's unfair. I've done everything I can to elevate your music, to give it the platform it deserves. Did you ever consider that I was exactly where I wanted to be?" The silence that followed was broken by the buzz of Jackson's phone. Another summons from the machine they'd stepped into. Hours later, after a dinner where Fiona had smiled politely while Director Harlow and Jackson discussed her music as if she weren't present, they stood outside her hotel room. "I need time to think," she said, key card in hand. Jackson nodded, his earlier frustration softened by the evening's wine and praise. "Take the night, but Victoria needs an answer by tomorrow morning." He hesitated, then leaned down to brush his lips against her cheek. "This could be beautiful. Fiona, us, the music, all of it." After he walked away, Fiona entered her room and immediately went to the window, opening it despite the chill. 17 floors below, the city continued its relentless rhythm. She reached for her phone and called the only person who would understand. "He's asking too much," she told Olivia after explaining the situation. "Is he asking, or is he assuming?" Olivia replied, her voice comforting despite the distance. "There's a difference, you know." Later, unable to sleep, Fiona took out her violin. Playing in the small hours had always been her way of finding clarity. But as she positioned the instrument beneath her chin, she noticed something, a nearly invisible hairline crack along the neck, likely stressed from travel and climate changes. It felt symbolic somehow, the first tangible evidence that removing herself from her natural environment carried consequences by morning. Fiona had made her decision. She found Jackson in the hotel restaurant, already deep in conversation with Victoria and two marketing executives. The table fell silent as she approached. "I've reviewed the contract," she said evenly. "I can't sign it as written." Victoria's smile tightened. "Perhaps we could discuss. I'll collaborate on the film score as originally agreed," Fiona continued. "But I won't relocate, and I won't commit to a tour or album until the score is complete and I've had time to consider what I truly want." Jackson stared at her, confusion evident. "Fiona, we talked about this. The timing is crucial for the label's marketing strategy," she finished, "not for the integrity of the music." Victoria stood, straightening her jacket. "I'll give you 2 a moment. But remember, Ms. Bennett, hesitation in this industry is often interpreted as lack of commitment, and Meridian partners only with fully committed artists." With that parting wisdom, she gestured for the marketing team to follow her. Once alone, Jackson leaned forward, voiced low and urgent. What are you doing? Do you realize what you're turning down? Fiona met his gaze steadily. I'm protecting what matters to me, something I thought you understood. She placed a hand on his, feeling the tension in his fingers. We can still create beautiful music together, Jackson, but on terms that honor why we started this in the first place. And if they walk away completely, then we'll know it was never about the music. Jackson withdrew his hand, something shifting behind his eyes. You don't understand what's at stake for me. This project isn't just a creative indulgence. My reputation, my financial stability, everything depends on its success. And that's exactly why I'm worried, Fiona replied softly. When everything depends on success, the first casualty is usually truth. As they sat in strained silence, surrounded by the polished surfaces and artificial lighting of a world Jackson had once escaped from and now seemed eager to re-enter, Fiona wondered if what had grown between them could survive. The pull of these opposing forces, her commitment to authenticity and his need for validation from an industry that had both made and broken him. The melody they'd created together now seemed to play in two different keys, no longer in harmony but creating a tension that demanded resolution. Whether that resolution would bring them closer or force them irreparably apart remained the unwritten measure in their complicated composition. Broken tempo. The return to Rosemary Cafe felt different now. Where Fiona had once found comfort in its weathered wooden floors and mismatched chairs, she now saw only the narrow boundaries of the life she'd chosen. 3 weeks had passed since New York, 3 weeks of stilted phone calls with Jackson. That grew progressively shorter until they stopped altogether. He's back in LA, Olivia said, sliding a tea across the counter. Tabloids say he's working with Celeste Munro on the film score now. Fiona nodded, trying to ignore the sting. Celeste Munro, acclaimed cellist, magazine cover regular, and precisely the kind of polished performer Victoria Winters had wanted. Good, the film deserves the best. Olivia's knowing look said everything her words didn't. That evening, as Fiona taught her last student of the day, 8-year-old Penny, whose enthusiasm far outweighed her technical skill, her phone buzzed with an email notification. The film's director had sent a rough cut of a pivotal scene, scored with Celeste's interpretation of what had once been Fiona's composition. After Penny left, Fiona sat alone in the community center's practice room, finally gathering the courage to watch. The music was technically flawless, arranged with Jackson's signature production style, but something essential was missing: the vulnerability, the raw emotion that had made their original collaboration special. She closed the laptop, feeling a complex mixture of vindication and loss. Later that night, rain pattered against her apartment windows as Fiona attempted to lose herself in composing. Her violin case lay open, but the instrument remained untouched. Instead, she found herself scrolling through music news sites, something she'd never done before meeting Jackson. The headline appeared like a slap. Producer Jackson Reed suffers setback as Meridian Records shelves anticipated film score. The article detailed how test audiences had responded poorly to the new musical direction. Quotes from anonymous sources close to the project suggested Jackson was difficult to work with, uncompromising, losing his commercial instincts. Before she could process this information, her phone rang. Olivia, turn on Entertainment Channel 6, Olivia said without preamble. Jackson's giving an interview. Fumbling for a remote, Fiona switched on the small television she rarely used. There he was, Jackson Reed, looking exhausted beneath the studio lights, a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. Creative differences, he was saying. Sometimes a project needs to evolve, in ways you don't initially expect. Sources claim you were replaced after insisting on working with an unknown violinist from New England. The interviewer pressed, any comment on how that decision affected your standing with Meridian? Jackson's mask slipped momentarily. Fiona Bennett is one of the most genuine talents I've ever encountered. The direction the project ultimately took wasn't what we had envisioned together. The interview continued, but Fiona heard nothing else. She sat motionless, rain and revelation washing over her simultaneously. Days passed. Fiona threw herself into teaching, into playing evening sessions at the cafe, into anything that might drown out the persistent thought that she had misjudged. Jackson entirely. Then came the package, a simple brown envelope delivered to the cafe. Inside was a USB drive with a handwritten note, what it should have been. No compromises. That night, after the cafe closed, Fiona, Olivia, and 3 regular patrons gathered around Fiona's laptop. The video file showed rough footage from the film, scored with the original compositions. Jackson's production paired with Fiona's unaltered playing, recorded during their sessions at the cafe. He kept the original recordings, Fiona whispered, and apparently lost his job defending them, Olivia added quietly. 2 days later, as October painted the trees outside the cafe in brilliant orange, the door chimed. Fiona looked up from her sheet music to find Jackson standing there, looking more like the lost traveler who'd first wandered in than the polished producer who'd left for New York. Olivia said, I might find you here, he offered, remaining by the door as if uncertain of his welcome. I heard what happened with Meridian. Jackson shrugged. Turns out Victoria and I have different definitions of artistic integrity. The silence between them felt both heavy and fragile. Why did you send me the recordings? Fiona finally asked. Because you were right. He took a step forward. I got caught up in what could be instead of protecting what already was. By the time I realized my mistake, it seemed too late to fix it. And now, Jackson glanced around the cafe, taking in the simple surroundings he'd once been so eager to leave behind. Now I'm starting over. I've launched an independent production company. Small projects, artists with something genuine to say. He hesitated. I'm staying in Boston for now. Close enough to visit but not presuming anything. Fiona stood, closing the distance between them. The violin piece you heard that first morning, do you know what it was about? He shook his head. Fear, she said simply. If you're of reaching for something more, of disturbing the safe but small life I'd built. You challenged that fear, Jackson. You made me consider possibilities I'd stopped allowing myself to imagine. And then I tried to push you too far, too fast. Yes, she smiled slightly. We both made mistakes. Outside, autumn leaves danced past the window, neither clinging to the branch nor rushing toward the ground, but finding grace in the journey between. Final Symphony Spring arrived in a burst of renewal, bringing with it the grand opening of Reed Independent Studios, housed not in Los Angeles or New York, but in a renovated textile mill 20 minutes from Rosemary Cafe. The building's brick exterior maintained its historical charm while its interior had been transformed into a state-of-the-art recording facility with perfect acoustics and windows that opened to the river below. It's really happening, Fiona marveled. Standing in the main studio where a small orchestra was setting up for the day's recording session, her violin rested against a chair marked with her name, concert master for this unprecedented project. The past 6 months had unfolded in ways neither she nor Jackson could have predicted. After their reconciliation, they'd started slowly rebuilding trust through small collaborations. Jackson had rented a cottage nearby, commuting to Boston when necessary but spending most evenings at the cafe, listening to Fiona play or simply talking until closing time, when the film director had reached out directly to them both, frustrated with the corporate-approved score and offering them complete creative control if they'd finished the project independently. It had felt like both vindication and opportunity. Ready for this? Jackson appeared beside her, tablet in hand. Gone were the designer suits and carefully maintained image. The man who stood beside her now wore his success, differently measured in creative freedom rather than industry validation. Fiona nodded, taking in the musicians who had traveled from across the country to be part of this unorthodox project, a film score that would be performed and recorded live, with minimal technical manipulation, preserving the human imperfections that gave music its soul. The day unfolded in a beautiful blur of creation. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the studio windows, they completed the final piece, the emotional climax of the film, where the protagonists finally understand that what they've been searching for has been within reach all along. When the last note faded, silence held the room in reverent suspension before erupting into spontaneous applause, not just from the musicians for each other, but for the journey this project represented. Later, as the others departed, Fiona and Jackson remained, sitting side by side on the edge of the stage that had been built in the studio's center. The director called. Jackson said, "He's bringing the producers to hear the final mix next week. Are you nervous?" Strangely, no. He turned to her. "Whatever happens with the film, we've already succeeded in the ways that matter." Fiona understood. In the month since that rainy night when Jackson had returned, they had created something neither of them could have achieved alone, not just music, but a model for how art could be produced with integrity, how careers could be built without compromise, how lives could intertwine without requiring either person to diminish. "I have something for you," Jackson said, reaching behind him to produce a slender case. Inside lay a bow masterfully crafted, perfectly balanced. "It's from Maurice Renoir's workshop in Paris," Jackson explained. "I noticed your current one has been repaired 3 times. Fiona ran her fingers along the bow's length, emotion catching in her throat. "It's beautiful, but this must have cost." "It's not about the cost," he interrupted gently. "It's about giving you the right tools for your voice." He paused. "Which reminds me of something else we need to discuss." From his pocket he produced a letter bearing the emblem of the Boston Symphony Orchestra. "They've requested you as a guest soloist for their summer series." Fiona stared at the letter. How did they even know about me? The film director showed their artistic director some early footage. The rest was all you. Jackson's pride was evident. "You don't have to answer right away. I know how much your teaching means to you." "Actually," Fiona said slowly, "I've been thinking about that. The community center has offered me a position developing a full music program. Fewer individual lessons but more impact overall." She looked up at him. "I could do both. Teach, perform, compose, no more false choices between worlds." Jackson reached for her hand, his thumb tracing the scar on her wrist, no longer a reminder of dreams deferred but of resilience. "There's one more thing," he said, voice suddenly uncertain. "The cottage lease is ending next month." Fiona's heart quickened. "I'm considering something more permanent. There's a house on River Road with a studio space that would be perfect for small recordings. And it's only 10 minutes from the community center." He met her eyes. "I'm not asking for anything except Your thoughts? Fiona smiled, understanding all he wasn't saying. I think, she said carefully, that home isn't about the right address. It's about where your music makes the most sense. She reached for her violin and the new bow, drawing out a few notes of the melody that had first caught Jackson's attention that fateful morning, except now it transformed, no longer speaking of fear but of possibility. That's beautiful, Jackson whispered. What would you call it? Fiona considered for a moment, watching as the last light of day illuminated dust motes dancing above them like stars in their own private universe. I'd call it Beginning Again, she said, and continued to play as Jackson closed his eyes, listening not just with his producer's ear but with his heart. The heart that had finally found its rhythm in the spaces between notes, in the courage of second chances, and in the quiet miracle of two people whose separate melodies had become an unexpected, perfect harmony. Outside the studio windows, spring flowers nodded in the gentle evening breeze, nature's silent applause for a love story written not in grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but in the faithful echo of daily choices to see, to hear, and to cherish what truly matters.